on how blended finance is scaling up. So I'd like to invite Ms. Soumya Lashkari from 361 Foundation.
Colors have changed. Should be orange. Good afternoon, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. Quick, I've been told this is a donor audience, so I'm presuming everyone in the room is familiar with blended finance? Quick show of hands, yes? Okay. How many of you all have actually participated in a blended finance transaction? And out of curiosity, how many of you all represent CSR or CSR funded organizations? And have any of you all taken part in a blended finance transaction? Come meet me after the session. Good afternoon, everyone. Soumya Lashkari. I set up and lead the 361 Foundation. Needless to repeat, I think we all know that blended finance provides a very innovative way to marry or blend private, public, and philanthropic capital. Enables us to increase not just the quantum of capital to finance development initiatives, but also deploy this capital far more effectively and efficiently to meet development outcomes. So, drives a much needed rigor in the sector and also significantly improves leverage and ROI for donors through collaboration. At least as far as CSR, from a CSR perspective, I think it's helped us graduate from the charity mindset, or the more traditional grant-giving mindset. Before I start, for those of you who are not familiar, 361 was formerly IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, one of India's leading wealth and alternatives-focused asset managers, with aggregate assets of around 345,000 crores, which I believe is $40 billion under management. 361 Foundation is a philanthropic arm of 361. Relatively new, maybe 3 years old, and we have reimagined traditional grant making and evolved a blended finance approach with CSR funds deployed to achieve and generate a higher social return by either unlocking capital, recycling funds, or focusing on outcomes. So we basically vet or co-create CSR-compliant blended finance approaches that maximize impact and enable a multiplier or an exponential impact for every contribution made. When I was asked to highlight the thinking behind our approach, or what prompted us to adopt this approach versus a more traditional legacy grant-giving approach, I thought there were actually 2 aspects at which this worked. So of course, the first, 361, as a company, very, very, very entrepreneurial, and I think, innovating to maximize financial return for all our clients is, core to the business. So for 361 Foundation to maximize social return was just a very natural evolution. We recognize that grants provide a unique pool of capital, which is risk tolerant, patient, very low or no return expectations. So
space. So let me begin with you, Soumya. This is a slightly different question. You are obviously sort of advising your clients across a spectrum of investment solutions. There will be commercial, there will be non-commercial, there is public, there is private venture capital, private equity, and there is also this whole space of philanthropy / blended finance. So from a demand perspective, when you look at this, and if I want to call blended finance as an asset class, what is the flavor of the thinking in the larger sort of HNI family office community? Is this something which is one of interest? Second is, does it have all the characteristics for it to be something that we can see family offices or HNI sort of look at in slightly larger scale and size? So how do you sort of see this marketplace?
So just a couple of comments on family offices. They normally say if you see one, you only see one, because no 2 family offices are alike. So what one also sees in the family office space is that different family offices are at different stages of evolution in their own family office journey. So when they initially come into wealth, maybe that's the first time they've had a liquidity event, and everything is about investing into markets, meeting all the wealth managers. It's almost a material kind of sense that you have to first take care of before you start getting into thinking about what can that capital do for good going forward. But I think the second thing that happens over time is that a lot of the family offices also are very conscious that they want to give back to society. And that's where the dilemma then comes in, saying, how do I give back? That's where I think organizations like ours try to step in to say that, yes, this is what you want to do, but then how do you make it a reality? How do you execute that? And I think that's where, when we look at capital for a family, we try and divide it up where we create a pool which is specifically what we call sustainable development capital. And that sustainable development capital is of two forms. It is grant making, and it is also where they may want to invest for commercial purposes which have impact. So that could be directly into companies, that could also be into impact funds and so forth. But I think one of the things that we noticed is that in the family office space, they're very binary. They either want to do grant giving only, or they want to have a bit of a commercial lens on impact. But one of the spaces which I think organizations like ours and maybe even more wealth management companies need to do is to really educate the client that grant making itself, or the capital you keep there, if you do blend it with something which is of a commercial transaction, can actually allow for what is an unviable investment to actually become viable.
Yeah.
So that education is absolutely key. But clearly the interest is there. For people who have money, they do want to give back to society.
No, yeah, I think that's a very important point, because I spent a long time of my career in structured finance and structured credit, and one of the rules we used to live with from a simplicity perspective is, if you can't explain to your grandmother what you're doing, it's complex, right? So you have to be able to explain in a very simple way what you're trying to do. And blended finance by its very nature is not very amenable to this kind of, sort of elevator pitch conversation. How do you kind of, how do we cross this? Because, philanthropy is very intuitively simple. There's someone who needs help and I'm here to help them. How do you kind of sort of cross this bridge?
So I think it's all about just understanding and being able to break it up into a way in which the family can actually understand what are we trying to do here. So for us, a large part of the work that we do is about education, is about awareness, because unless you cross that hurdle, you're not going to get much further. So I think that's the first thing that we would actually pretty much look at, and of course reduce the complexity and the jargon.
Yeah. Just moving on now to the two bankers, just thought I'd get a sense in terms of, is there enough demand from your side? I think increasingly now banks are looking at this whole space of beyond PSL sustainable finance, building a sustainable finance book. I would believe strategically is something which is very important from a bank. Not pure play only from an ESG perspective, but also sort of starting to look at markets which are hitherto not fully sort of explored. So whether it is climate financing, and obviously we have to think beyond rooftop solar and the regular, if I may say, institutionalized markets. How are sort of banks, sort of getting ready for this whole space of sustainable finance? Both of you have had some experience, so maybe you can share some thoughts on this.
You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So, priority sector lending anyway was initially a regulatory requirement which banks had to go through. But what is the positive outcome of it is that banks have started thinking of the sector not in terms of a regulatory obligation, but something that is self-sustaining finance which will take care of itself in a commercially viable manner. So that is a clear direction at every bank actually, be it private sector and increasingly with the public sector. However, the point remains that there are certain sectors which are not as mature in the finance domain as others, and that is where these interventions are required. So blended finance has to be very, very carefully used. If a bank first needs to look at finance, it will look at commercial finance, and that should always be the first priority. However, it is only when we are looking at sectors where we know one, either they're greenfield or there are some pioneering initiatives which are happening, that is where the entire concept of blended finance comes in. That is at one level. And the second level is even in slightly mature markets, I'm not saying fully mature markets, but at mid-level mature markets, sometimes you hit a cap and hence there's a requirement for some innovation which is required in the sector, and that is again where blended finance can play a role, whether it is equity, debt, subsidies, grants, in whichever form, and each of these play different roles for us, right? So even at Axis, the whole point is there are certain sectors where we believe that financing has been a little more challenging as far as scale up is concerned, and I'm going to talk about mostly the agri sector is something which we think increasing.
From Axis and Aloka from HSBC and Soumya from Waterfield Advisors to be journalists. Will know, others may not know, how all of these people have in various ways sort of participated in the blended finance kind of area, and that will just give you all a perspective and a flavor of the work that they've been doing, and then we can take it forward. So I think Sohini and Axis Bank already have spoken, but maybe you can start and then we can go around the other people.
So Axis Bank has been quite an early entrant into this space because we actually had India's first internationally listed green bond on the London Stock Exchange in 2015. For financing climate change solutions. We further did in 2021 another green bond from international investors for supporting social and green sectors. We worked with other blended finance facilities. Samrid has been a very interesting partner who we have worked with for this pay for success model in blended finance for our healthcare segment. I will speak about all of these in detail a little later, but I will at least give you a broad breadth of what all we've been doing. We worked with Guarantco, which is the guarantee arm of PIDG, and that has been an initiative in the e-mobility sector where we fund enterprises which are in the manufacturing, battery, charging, etc. space. This is a sector which is really picking up and is of key interest. We've had programs with ADB for partial guarantee program funding structures for supply chain finance in the impact space, the MSME space, so that has been on board. We worked with grant funds also, so with ADB we have a technical assistance program which we run for women in the so in social enterprises in the microfinance space to enable them to scale up groups of women borrowers in India. So that is another program which we run, and these are some of the examples of blended finance which we do at the bank.
So one of our founding philosophies right from the very beginning was to pioneer and participate in, like I said, CSR compliant blended finance instruments. And our goal was to deliver better outcomes and amplify impact for underserved communities through, of course, increased leverage of CSR funds. And in fact, now in year 2 or year 2.5 actually, we've actually started calculating and reporting financial leverage, impact leverage, and additional beneficiaries reached ratio for each and every one of our our grants or our projects or our portfolio, so to say. The second level I think that prompted us was at an individual or a personal level. I spent a decade in technology with General Electric in the US before crossing over to the social sector about, I think, 15 years ago and leading CSR portfolios for companies like Genpact and Godrej Industries. And perhaps it was my Black Belt Six Sigma training, but at a very personal level, I think I, as an individual, believe in driving efficiency and effectiveness of capital, be it philanthropic or be it CSR, for a few years. So the point I'm trying to make is unless you as a donor, individually, fundamentally believe that this is good for your portfolio, until you're convinced as a donor, it might be hard to champion this change within your organization. So I think there were kind of two levels at which we started off with the ethos of saying, let us try to catalyze and pioneer blended finance in a CSR compliant way. Given this context, a few approaches, all of us know that CSR is heavily regulated, so a few approaches that have worked well for us so far are what you see on the screen in front of you. Of course, pay for outcomes or results-based financing, or a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms for that space, but that's the underlying tenet for most of our programs. Fundamentally, where CSR pays only if certain pre-agreed outcomes are met. So we have a couple of programs in that bucket. Returnable grants, I think that's been mentioned once or twice already earlier today. We have about 4 projects in returnable grants, and that's for the most vulnerable who are locked out of formal economy. Essentially, CSR is given as a zero-interest loan with only a moral obligation to repay. And if returned, it is kind of recycled to grant and aid the next set of beneficiaries. The third is risk guarantees. I've kind of clubbed that in with interest subvention as well. And I'm going to get into more details of the Samrit project for that. But we've got 2 risk guarantee projects where essentially CSR acts as a guarantor and provides a risk guarantee by de-risking investments and improving the risk-return profiles relative to market norms. And social success, and finally social success note, where I think Himanshu just mentioned, CSR acts as an outcome-based financing instrument that reduces the cost of borrowing if a few pre-agreed outcomes are met. We are somewhat participating in an impact bond also. It hasn't formally launched, but that's the last instrument on this slide as well. So that's kind of the continuum or the capital of the blended finance continuum that we've been participating in. Just real quick, given in terms of a thematic priority, given 361's leadership and expertise, domain expertise in financial services, thematically 361 Foundation prioritizes financial inclusion and access to finance as a lever to improve livelihoods. Not to say that other sectors aren't important, it's just that we have limited resources, so we wanted to have a razor-sharp focus on a thematic priority. We also gender split, large percentage being female. In blue, you see kind of the training, certification, and placement statistics. Mean monthly income being about 13,000 per month. Average improvement in monthly household income being 2.3x. And the number of trained beneficiaries facilitated in procuring loans for established enterprises has been 7. So just a snapshot of the actual impact being delivered on the ground. And last slide is just, voice of the beneficiary. Anjali from Andhra Pradesh, who's actually taken part in this program and has been placed and happily placed and enjoying the benefits of the trade. So with that, unless there are any questions, I'll wrap up by just saying that I think while blended finance is in its infancy stages in India, I'm hopeful that reports such as these, forums such as these, dialogues such as these, and game changers like IBFC, blended finance, IIC and IBFC, Asha Impact, and people like yourselves in the room and all my co-presenters will help change this and bring about the change and pave the way for more blended finance transactions down the road. Thank you.
The traffic starts in Mumbai in the later part of 5:45 or so. So let me sort of, with that quick intro, one of the very early sort of movers, if I may say, many years back. So some thoughts from your side?
Sure. Like you said, many years ago, 15 years ago, when access to finance for the informal segment was pretty much an idea and not a reality at most of the banks. Largely because there are no documented papers on which somebody could lend, and microfinance was a sunrise sector at that time. Those two kind of fit what we wanted to in terms of enabling access. Now, it wasn't a connection at all. It's not as if you are an intermediary and you just need to have a discovery process where you connect a bank such as Axis and say that these are either borrowers or these are companies which are funding these borrowers, why aren't we just finance them? That wasn't the issue. It's not as much on discovery, but more in terms of building that kind of knowledge and doing the underwriting yourself. So the key aspect for us was enabling skin in the game. And that is where a large part of this blended finance or structured finance piece comes in. We spent a lot of time in terms of understanding the segment, understanding the companies, and committing our own capital total in a junior tranche. So we can call it blended finance. In the end, it's really structured finance. The key difference being that the risk capital in blended finance is expected to get no returns. The risk capital in our case were expected to get higher returns. But that structure really took off, and one of the exponents of that is the pass-through certificate structure, which is highly prevalent in the country today, thanks to regulatory push as well on PSL. And we were able to combine and structure transactions which we gave innovative names to and patents as well. So something like a spice bond, which is pretty much just a partial guarantee or something to lift the credit profile of a particular bond or an instrument, so that it becomes palatable for commercial capital to come in. Because 90% of the money has to come in from commercial capital, and only a small sliver of that can come in from players such as us, or maybe from CSR and other foundations. Then there was something called as the mosaic bond that we did, where because the companies which were to be funded were small, and the bank is very large, we were able to combine a lot of the companies into a pool structure, and then call it a mosaic platform, which then ensured that the transaction sizes were larger. So it's all about building scale, especially for a country like India, right? We saw a lot of examples in the earlier presentations on innovations, but those innovations at an instrument level are only useful if you can then scale that up to hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. So those are some of the things that we did.
Great.
What's happened in the past, let's try and understand how blended finance now scales up for the future. For this, we have with us a panel of industry experts. Ramraj will be moderating this panel discussion. Ramraj, I request you to introduce the panel and take
Actually called blended finance. So this was really to IFM.
As an industry, we have this unique capacity to
Absolutely.
keep, giving new names to, I think, what lots of us have been doing for a long conversation. So maybe, Ravi, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Ramraj. Hopefully I'm audible. Hi, I'm Ravi.
We went on to work very closely with Northern Arc to actually create a fund structure where we could actually pool capital in so that they could then make those issuances to whoever they were subsequently lending to. So for us, that was our first kind of association with blended finance. Today it's morphed a little bit more into impact funds because that's a very big area where our clients are looking at. And I think what we are fairly uniquely placed to be able to take the capital from the people who do have the capital and bring it back to the sectors that actually need it. So I see ourselves pretty much like a bridge between those who have and those who don't have, and how can we actually play that more meaningfully. And I think the third place that we were looking at a blended finance transaction. We started on a DIB, which we were very keen to do. Today, some of our families, investors, risk investors, into some of these structures. So for us, it's really been 3 levels. First, in terms of just concessional capital, the second in terms of impact funds, and the third really in terms of DIBs and SIBs.
So, I think we are 3 of us from banks, and if you see the entire conversation actually revolves around inclusive banking or priority sector lending, where we've done, I think most financial institutions in India have done various kinds of financing, and which can actually fall into the blended finance piece that we spoke about, PTCs and others. Let me just take a different thing, but let me just take grants and give an example. One of the things that we as an institution that we do is that we use grants to create solutions. That's something which is a board-directed objective for us, and this is not now, I'm just talking about many years. I joined the bank in 2010, even before that. There was a lot of focus on how you use money which is not really too big, but to create solutions. So one of the things I'm talking about pre-Companies Act, and when we had a certain amount of funding available with us with grants, what we tried to do is work on products, and I can see Bhatsab is here, Friends of Women's World Banking, and I'm talking about many years back, we actually worked on a revolving fund. When, and those days were the very, very early years of non-profits actually giving, what you call microfinance organizations, not MFIs, but MFOs giving loans. And I still remember there was a need for individual loans. As if you know the MFI sector, there is a lot of focus on SHG loans and, but there was a lot of focus on individual loans, and I remember working with Friends of Women's World Banking on the revolving fund levels. Second, what we did was we used it as guarantees in the past. And what happened after that? Once the Companies Act came into the picture, naturally, the compliance piece has become is something that we're all looking at, right? Because when you have compliance, you have to be very, very careful in terms of how you spend this money. But even with that, I think we've had some success. And Sonia, you mentioned, how many people are able to use CSR funds. And let me tell you, I represent an organization which is not just CSR fund, but it's FCRA fund, so it's foreign currency. But even that, we've had some success. I just maybe mention one thing and just hand over. We ran with a grant program, we ran a skilling program for about, it was a 5-year skilling program where we invested a significant amount of money with outcome. It was an outcome-based program. It was not blended finance, by the way. It was just an outcome-based program. But today, whenever we are doing something, we always talk about millions of numbers. What we have realized that when you're designing a program of that sort, you have to look at cost. You have to look at that, how many. So I'll just tell you, 50 crore rupees, 30,000 people in 5 years with 70% place. That's what we aimed for. And we had a rather, and risk is another parameter that we looked at. When you're creating grant programs and when you're using blended finance, it's important to also focus on that. What happened as a result of that is that NSDC, we sat with NSDC, and a lot of learnings from our outcome-based skilling program was actually used to create the country's first skill impact bond by NSDC. And we actually were successful in also becoming an outcome funder through our grants for the skill impact bond. So I'll stop here, and of course.
Thank you. I think what amazed me when I first spoke to her is the innovation in using grant funding, on balance sheet funding in structures, and I think a large part of the market is not even in fact aware of some of the work that I think HSBC has been doing. I think let me just get into the business end of this whole panel, and before I want to open up to questions. I just want to kind of focus on this on 2-3 broad issues, and let me just start on the first. On the first side is really I just want to look at the demand. So we have banks,
which is a group involved largely in financial services. We started about 15 years ago with a mission to expand the range of financial services in India in terms of enabling access. Started out with microfinance, and now we lend to almost every sector under the sun. Proud to say that we have managed to attract a lot of commercial capital into these sectors, so much so that what was earlier niche has now become mainstream, and maybe we can get into some examples during the panel.
Hi, I'm Sohini.
from Axis Bank, the other third largest private sector bank in the country. I don't think I need to speak much more about that. I lead the priority sector lending and the inclusive finance portfolio for Axis.
I'll go next. I'm Aloka Majumdar. I'm from HSBC India. I look after sustainability for HSBC in India. We structure it a bit differently. So one part of my work is actually related to sustainable finance and the other is grant. So that's how we work, and of course we'll talk about it more as we go forward.
I'm Soumya Rajan. I'm the founder of Waterfield Advisors. We're a multifamily office and a wealth advisory company. We are India's largest family office, managing assets of about 5 billion. I founded the company with the intention of having no conflict of interest in the way in which we manage our client money. But in the process also found that non-investment related work was equally important, if not more, for the families that we work with. So we have both a practice in investments and non-investments. Philanthropy and impact forms a very, very big part of what we do, and which is why I'm happy to share some of my thoughts today on the panel.
We are in about 85-86% of our farmers are small and marginal farmers, and access to finance is difficult for them. So Axis has Bharat Bank as one initiative because we believe that the next level of growth is going to come from Bharat rather than from India. So we have a very focused approach towards this segment, which is more in the rural and semi-urban space. And here we believe that experimentation both at our end, where we have had equity participation in government projects like the Common Service Centers, for example, CSC, which is a very important partner for us because they are about 5-6 lakh of them in various corners of the country, providing finance and non-financial services to the populace. So we have an equity participation there. We've done equity participation in Agrim, which is input marketplace. And we believe that there are certain sectors which require a little more of a push, and where we would be interested in partnering with entities, DFIs, other grant funds, etc., which can help us scale these up. WASH has been a very difficult sector for banks to really have a toehold in, right? Because often, given the structures of WASH and the way it is structured by governments, often let us forget OPEX. CAPEX. Even OPEX is difficult to really recover, and maintenance costs. So that is a sector which I think requires deep thinking and innovative practices. There are hybrid models which even our government has put in place. So HAM is something which is happening, but I don't think there's enough participation which has happened in this sector. Energy, yes, energy, while solar energy has seen some takeoff, and there have been participation in that, but right now I think biogas, biomass, waste and energy is something which needs to see some more action. So banks will be keenly looking at these sectors as well. And how it helps is, we heard a lot about the Samrid example, is that, even if I take an example of, say, Samrid, it's what happens is that it just enables banks to take calls on many more entities because the financing becomes a little more viable. And what is very important is, while we've been financing healthcare earlier, because this is a performance-based payout based on certain predetermined outcomes, it makes the banks' understanding of viability of certain sectors much sharper. Because we would have funded healthcare, but we would not really have worked at seeing how that healthcare funding is being directed to the more vulnerable population, looking at gender cuts, looking at economic viability cuts, etc., looking at disadvantaged parts of the population. So that is what is very, very important, is that the outcome measurements which come into play once we do this. And we may be doing priority sector lending, we definitely look at end user priority sector, but this is a very sharp way of doing things in the corporate sector, which is usually not focused on unless we have this on us as a structure, which is what makes it very
great.
important.
No, I think some good points, especially on building that institutional culture and kind of getting a sense of, because banks will hate something which is bespoke. So, the more you can sort of commoditize and institutionalize it, the greater the Aloka from your side.
Yeah. So I think you spoke about sustainability and sustainable finance, and just to tell you that how it's being looked at our end, it's being looked at more as an imperative. It's being looked at more with an opportunity lens. So the way HSBC is looking at sustainability is that we, today most large global corporations as well as many companies across India and emerging economies, you see they have all set time-bound net zero targets.
Yeah.
And that's something which will require various kinds of financing. I think from a financial institutions perspective, the financial institutions will play a very important role, because this entire piece will require our clients to transition to lower carbon emission, and that will have a cost, and therefore there will be a huge amount of funding which will be available required for that.
Got it.
So from HSBC's perspective, we are looking at from three things in terms of if you take net zero. One is, of course, becoming a net zero bank ourselves. So we want to be the world's first financial institution to go net zero. We made some very big targets, very, very challenging and complex ones. But the thing is, I think from the top, the thing is that you put a target and you work backwards. That's something that's working. The second is, we've also said that we'll be investing close to about $750 billion to $1 trillion in the next 10 years, which will be required for transitioning of our clients.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a huge amount of money, and we've made that kind of investment. And the third is going to be unlocking solutions and innovations. These are the three things. I think one point I want to say that is, while all these investments, there will be investments in tech, there has to be investments in innovations, etc. But you will require multilateral agencies and other credit guarantees to actually provide long-term credit wraps. Because if you want banks to actually lend, that has to be available in this entire sustainability journey, because it's a huge amount of funding that we need.
I think excellent to be able to do this. But the reality is that this market is extremely fragmented, small, transaction sizes are small, and if I may say, very bespoke and complex. All of these are, in my view, not enemies, but they are friction points for a scalable market. A scalable market is one where the front end is simple, where things can be invested in easily, they are replicable, so costs come down, and more and more people can keep doing the same things in different ways. So just moving on to the next question from a scalability perspective, just thought we can get perspectives from the audience on what is it that can be done to really scale this market, because I think, as Aloka said, you need credit wraps, you need credit guarantees. There are a whole host of other things that can be done. So I think the big question is around scalability, and maybe I'll just start with you, Soumya, in terms of what are your thoughts on what can be the few things which can be done to make this market, something which is, say, 5x or 10x of what it is today in maybe 2, 3, 4 years' time. I mean, do you have any sort of thoughts around the whole scalability issue?
So I think one of the things that happened today, just the fact that you got on our website on blended finance, we have a report which has come out from IIC and Asha, in fact, to just be a body of work when we can have one place where we can actually talk about this, or the fact that you have the India Blended Finance Collaborative. These are all initiatives which I think are a step in the right direction, because ultimately for, let's say, stakeholders of ours which are family offices, their biggest challenge is, how do I participate? They don't know how to participate. So at the one end, you've got the institutions which are doing something, but the family offices ultimately are semi-institutional participants in this ecosystem as well. But certainly these two are two cohorts which should come together to take the agenda forward. So participation through, I think, what you've got right now, and some of the initiatives which have come up today is important. The second is that I think for the ecosystem to evolve, you also do need evidence of a track record. And somewhere I feel that we are evolving. So to even have other people join this journey, you will have to have some kind of evidence that they will need to see. Maybe again, the corporates, the family offices, the semi-institutional capital, they have to lead the way first before we actually see this. But again, it's about also showcasing opportunities that have worked. I don't think perhaps there is enough of that, because that's the way you build some groundswell, you build some momentum, because you're actually seeing something that does work. Just to give an example, I sit on a couple of boards of NGOs, and I know that we were evaluating where we would have been a recipient of a DIB. And there was a huge discussion at the board to even say, should we even do this? Because on the NGO side, there's a bit of skepticism as well. Because one, in terms of, I have to do all these things to track this impact, I've got to figure out how to do this because somebody else is going to be asking me a lot of questions. And then if I am part of a DIB, which is multiple NGOs, and if some of the NGOs fail, then reputationally, do I, as an NGO that may have performed, do I have a reputational issue because I'm part of this larger cohort? These are challenges which are on the ground. So for all that we may say, these are practical issues which I've actually gone through.
Got it. Yeah. So, any thoughts from maybe Ravi? You've been in this space for quite a long time, and I think you've sort of mastered that senior subordinate, partial guarantee, and variants of this. So how do you move this to the next level? And I'd like you to answer this question, not as much, I think Soumya's given an excellent view of how family offices and not-for-profits will look at it. I want you to sort of think about this question from a larger financial engineering perspective. How is it, what would be, if let us say we went to the Ministry of Finance and they tell us, you tell me, how should we sort of accelerate this market? And I know it's a slightly out of syllabus question, but because it's very easy to ask the question, but if somebody says, you tell me how will we structure it, what could be the 2-3 sort of bigger sort of ways in which we could think about this at a more industry or at a macro level?
Sure, it is out of syllabus. So let me start with an example, right? What Soumya said, when 7 years ago we partnered, Soumya partnered with us in terms of enabling HNI capital towards the structure that we're doing. It was a simple senior-junior tranche. And because we were able to put the risk capital, we could get commercial capital in from a hitherto untapped source. HNIs had never invested in them. In the end, the aim is to make sure that you can scale the business and scale that kind of fund in a transaction. When we did the first fund, that was a 50 crore fund, maximum scalability 100 crores. Today we are launching 1,000+ crore funds using the same structure. Earlier it was only 2-3 investors. Now we have investors from NBFCs, banks, development finance institutions, HNIs, institutions from Europe, US, etc. Everybody coming into a standardized structure. So that was what people like. Like you said, if you can explain and you can show a track record that this structure has delivered from an outcome perspective, from an acceptability perspective, from a regulatory perspective, you can take that and showcase it as a fill it, shut it, forget it kind of solution, right? Now, you want to replicate that across different sectors. It has to start with instruments and vehicles which start at a smaller scale. So as what Himanshu spoke about a Samrit bond. The size will be small, but the next idea of doing it at a pool or a fund level is where you can bring in a lot more practicality and get a lot more different kinds of capital in there. So let me give you an example again. A bond can only be rated with a 1 rating. You have to fit this instrument into the commercial capital providers realm. A bank will only invest in a certain kind of credit instrument, etc. or sector. And HNI will invest in a specific kind. At an instrument level, you cannot get 3 ratings for the same bond. And therefore, a senior investor, I will get a AA. For a junior investor, I will get a AAA. But in a fund structure or pooling vehicle, we did the same thing. We had a AA+ structure for the senior investors, which ensured that we could tap names such as insurance companies. Across all the blended finance transactions, you will never see, even in a PTC, an insurance company ever participate. But when you do it at a pool structure, then you're able to do this. So the idea is to standardize the same thing across segments. Financial services lends beautifully to scale. And that is why you've seen such large numbers in this. You want to do the same thing in education, healthcare, agri, etc. Some of them are not completely commercial in nature, especially education and healthcare. There is a need for capital which never comes back in some of those segments. So the idea is for the Blended Finance Initiative to come up with structures that they can show to the regulator, saying that we have this structure, now you ensure that you open the, or you do the enabling perspective to ensure that large pools of capital can participate. Now, how do you ensure that an insurance company can participate in an unrated structure? Or the pension fund, which has never even seen what an alternative fund is or a structured bond is, it's not covered in the list of instruments because the government has not enabled some of these things.
Right.
How do you ensure that the regulator
Right.
gets some of these things? So, what they call is the sandbox. So these are the kind of structures that we need to propose.
And one
Yeah,
point,
please, please.
the only thing, I mean, in terms of challenges, and if you're working with a non-profit sector in particular, there are two things. One is that if you're expecting the existing team of the non-profit sector to report, the building capacity of the non-profit sector will be important, and also who will bear the costs. That's something that we have to think of. Nobody thinks of that. Everybody thinks that they'll deliver everything. It's not possible. That's one. And the second is also, I think there needs to be a lot of capacity building in terms of identifying risks. Because typically in any non-profit, when we're working with them, there is no concept of risk. It's only about output and outcomes.
Yeah.
But I think it's extremely important that we start working on risk. We start with the non-profit sector to say outright that these are risks. And I think that's something which is going to be critical. We do it. We actually work with our partners to at least start identifying. But I think we need to do a lot more in that space.
Right. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to take off from what Ravi was talking about the government interventions, because see, the main issue which we feel is there in the sector is that other than the BTC and DA market, which is fairly mature here, but in all the other sectors, one is there's complete information asymmetry across the sector. There's small pilots which are happening across the place. Information sharing is fairly minimal. Even within banks, I would feel that there'll be small teams would be working on this. It's not like every group is aware of this. So those teams would go and
capability or capacity building, market linkages, government linkages, overlaid with access to finance and financial inclusion. So fundamentally, our goal is to build the necessary bridges between informal and unorganized sectors and formal sources of credit, and nudging vulnerable and marginalized communities towards formal lending and banking challenges. Before I get into the real life example, a deep dive, I just wanted to highlight that blended finance is not a one-size-fits-all type solution, and there are specific instances where it's a powerful tool for change. So what we also do is we kind of start off saying what is a problem to be solved and what are the different forms of capital required to solve that problem. And that's what helps us advise different forms of capital as well as different recipients in a more structured format. Of course, we have to assess the readiness, capability, credibility, absorptive capacity of the implementation partners. And finally, as Himanshu can attest, all the CSR regulations and all the CSR compliances and making sure it's 110% CSR compliant. So there is a process that we kind of follow to even come up with projects that we can fund. The best practice or real life example that I was asked to highlight or do a deep dive into, it's just 2 slides. I think Himanshu talked about the Samrid platform. We have funded kind of a project within that facility, but it's the livelihood generation through skilling project under the Samrid umbrella. Essentially, a 30% partial risk guarantee to unlock concessional capital, along with an incentive for placement and retention in the form of a social success note. So the objective of this project, and the transaction is to generate livelihoods for beneficiaries from vulnerable communities, right? That was the problem we were trying to solve for through skilling. IIT Delhi, through its research and development, had deployed and developed a new blended finance, innovative finance solution to enable skilling and placement, essentially what I said, the risk guarantee. It allowed for exponentially impacting 7x beneficiaries in comparison to training had we given a vanilla grant. So the 7x additional beneficiaries reach ratio was kind of something that was one of the incentives for us to participate in this project. The financing solution obviously enabled the implementing entity to offer short-term training and placement to beneficiaries, either through fee-based or government-sponsored model schemes. In a nutshell, the project was kind of had two parts. The first part of the first phase focused on training, and that's where the project leveraged our grant of 1.33 crores to unlock additional working capital loan of 4 crores from NSDC at an affordable rate of 6% only per annum through the partial risk guarantee. This loan enabled Skilltree to train and place 2420 beneficiaries. So that's about a 3 to 4x number of beneficiaries in the first year itself compared to a traditional vanilla grant. And of course provide them employment opportunities and livelihood linkages. The guarantee was renewable for 2 years. So the guarantee was not invoked, or was partially invoked in the second year. It will be utilized, is being utilized to further enable a working capital loan and training additional beneficiaries. And in the third year, in case the guarantee is not invoked after the first 2 years, the balance amount will be utilized in the form of a vanilla grant to directly fund end beneficiaries. So that was essentially the first part of the first phase of the project. The second phase, which focused more on placement and retention, was a social success note. So on achievement of an additional milestone, so when the evidence would prove that beneficiaries were retained in their jobs for 3 months post-placement, a component of our grant will be used kind of as a social success note linked to placement and retention, thus leading to further reduction in the cost of borrowing for the implementing entity and incentivizing the risk investor or NSDC for better.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, I appreciate it. Thank you. I will send you a message. So, 1 second. Please go ahead.
65% split between these two sectors. Again, I don't think any surprises here, just given the financial services sector's amenability to more simpler, large structures as well. It's a better regulated and well-funded structure. And the global thrust that energy has seen, in India as well now, but globally as well, we're seeing a lot of capital flow into this sector, as Vikram and Mr. Amarjeet had also discussed earlier. Climate finance as well as green bonds, blue bonds, all seem to be converging over here. Talking about leverage, which is a very important and critical measure of success of a blended finance transaction.
It's because we're having a parallel launch in Delhi, so we're just saving the full download for that. But what we'd like to really, with your blessing, sir, is launch the formal launch of the India Blended Finance website. This is the website, as Ramraj mentioned earlier, the one-stop shop for everything that you ever wanted to learn about blended finance, enhance your knowledge, contribute to it. Everything is what you see here. A complete repository on different types of resources, no matter where you are in your blended finance journey. Right from someone just wanting to enter it, or someone who's an expert practitioner and looking to share their thoughts. So very, very glad to inaugurate this website today as well.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. I hope I can keep a copy.
Lastly, I think in terms of what we need to do to scale blended finance market in India, again, these are some points that we've been hearing repeatedly from the market. We touched upon this in the conversation earlier as well. There is a lot in terms of regulatory and legal clarity that needs to be put forward, and this is where I think working with the government is really essential to create an enabling and sort of a flourishing blended finance market in India. Institutional frameworks, SSE is a great example of that, could also help bring in commercial capital that is sitting on the fence. If we are increasing transparency, as Vikram and Amarjeet talked about earlier, we could see a lot more return-seeking capital coming. When one's talking about scale, there is definitely room for more templatized large-scale facilities that can actually help over here and reduce the cost of structuring. And then lastly, for more actors to start working together, I think there is room for more data-driven conversations, more evidence around the impact that's created around the actual structures that are being used, as well as the financial returns that are being generated in some of these structures. So there is a lot of room for transparency and more documentation. So that's about it from us. There's a lot more examples, a lot more commentary and insights that are available in the report, and we really hope our labor of love is enjoyed by all of you. We've been working at this for on this in the last year. A huge thank you to StockGen CSR, through whose support we were actually able to put out this report as well, and to everybody in the room. Thank you so much. We had Swati, Divya, Ramraj, Shivika, all co-authors on the report, and for all of your time as well for providing us the details as well as the semi-structured interviews and conversations to put this report together. So thank you all of you, and over to you, Divya.
You have a general template, and but again, you will probably need industry-specific templates going forward. But all those things will evolve. Yeah. And indexation, I think we haven't thought of it so far. If it gains traction, it would be something on the lines of ESG, although as a regulator, I'd like to see them in two different buckets. ESG, a lot of it is mandatory, and it's sort of it's a movement which has already taken off. As I see, we are at a stage of an infant. We just need to first find our feet and start walking, and then we'll see. So on ESG side, the evolution has been on the similar lines. We have a general template. There is a need for an industry-specific template. All those things will evolve. We have ESG rating, so we have put our regulatory framework around that as well. So I think it's something of the future. As of now, we want to focus on taking off in a meaningful manner with some good, both for-profit and not-for-profit register and list there.
Okay. I thought it would be important for us to learn from ground-up challenges which can pave the way for the opportunities that lie ahead. And for this discussion, we have with us two experts who will be sharing their takeaways. Mr. Himanshu Sikka, Project Director, Samvid Healthcare Blended Finance Facility and Chief Strategy and Diversification Officer, IPE Global Limited, and Ms. Soumya Lashkari, Director and Board Member at 361 Foundation. Mr. Sikka, I'd like you to invite you to please speak about Samvid.
Blending is trending. So as of 2022, the markets hit 1 billion, and these are conservative estimates. We feel through our ground-up approach, we probably have covered maybe 70 to 80% of the market. So this could actually be 20 to 25% higher. So the Indian blended finance market cumulatively is about 5.6 billion over the last 10 plus years. And this represents about 3.5% when you look at this on a global figure of about 160 billion. Of the 5.6 billion, about 80% of this has come from commercial investors and the other 20% from concessional capital. On average, we've been seeing about 14 blended finance transactions in India. Again, comparing this to the global blended finance market where you have about 55 transactions per year. So there's a lot of room for us to grow in India. But we do believe that the market is at an inflection point now, and there's a lot of activity that's picking up. Great. So when we look at the mix of investors in commercial capital, banks and NBFCs in India have been the most prominent investors. Globally, this figure is dominated by MDBs, multilateral development banks, as well as DFIs. But in India, it's banks and NBFCs that have been leading the charge. But we still feel that there's a lot more that can be done here. Key challenges that came up in some of our conversations are about adequate pipeline, finding the right scale and structure, as well as impact investment. And I think that is an important point to drive home, because one is talking about blending of capital. Philanthropic capital or concessional capital is looking for a more evolved impact assessment, which oftentimes commercial capital cannot provide because they don't have the capacity within their teams. So that seemed to be creating a little bit of a dissonance and trust issues as well. On the catalytic capital side, we've seen international foundations as well as DFIs play the major role over here. Some of the insights that emerged were really the cross-border learning, the knowledge sharing that these institutions are driving in India. An important point to highlight here is on sunset clauses that came up in our discussions with concessional capital providers. They felt that there should be sunset clauses in contracts so that they're not providing capital on concessional terms on a never-ending basis, but in order to be able to leverage concessional capital more, we need to kind of put these in place. And as you see a sector or a product de-risk, you would see the leverage move up. The last 2 points I think kind of got touched upon here as well. When Vikram and Mr. Ramanjeet were speaking, I think there's a huge potential for family offices, and we'll hear Soumya Rajan from Waterfield Advisors talk about how this opportunity could be interesting for family offices. As well as from a CSR perspective, Soumya Lashkari will be talking about how their foundation, 361, has built their entire philosophy around using blended finance to see that increased leverage. From an instrument perspective, we've seen bulk of the market really focused on guarantees, followed by TAs and subordinate and concessional debt. Globally, though, concessional debt has been the preferred instrument, but in India, given the perceived risk in some of the sectors, as well as low to middle income economies, we've seen guarantees enjoy the bulk of the market. From a volume perspective as well, 1 in 2 instruments has been a guarantee. Examples here could be USAID, USDFC guarantees that have been used across sectors like agri, healthcare, WASH, to catalyze this space. TA and grant instruments have also played a very important role in driving growth and innovation in the Indian market. Again, an example here could be the water credit microfinance loans that have helped catalyze the space for sanitation loans, as well as creating access to drinking water. The other end of the spectrum has been results-based financing instruments. So you obviously see that less than 2% of the market is what people popularly refer to as impact bonds, social success notes. They've enjoyed bulk of the media attention, but they're a small part of the market, but they have had an outsized impact in driving attention on outcomes and really creating evidence of what works on the ground. When we look at instrument usage across sectors, we've seen some of the more mature sectors like financial services using simpler structures such as concessional capital and then guarantees. So if we were to kind of plot this on a vintage and scalability perspective, I think the newer structures are more bespoke, being used for to prove a point of concept. And then they make way for simpler, more scalable structures over time, such as guarantees, and then more simpler concessional capital. Looking at vehicles, I think this is important as well. So globally, funds have been the more preferred vehicle for blending. However, in India, we're seeing facilities enjoy outsized amount of the market. There are emerging examples again of blended capital in a fund structure. In fact, I was talking to Starlene earlier today. We're looking at a blended equity fund in India. But facilities here have, given the high level of customization that they offer right at the top level, as well as the ability to pool funds from multiple investors, and then, at the lowest level, really customize what investees need in terms of support, in terms of diligence. It's this level of risk mitigation as well as customization that have made them the preferred vehicle for lending in India. Funds, as I mentioned, we've not really seen much of a blended capital stack here, and they lack much precedence, but we are seeing now emerging examples of that. Samrit, has been a great example in India. Over the last couple of years, they've been able to mobilize close to $300 million. And we have Himanshu here, who's the director at Samrit, who will be talking about this during our case study presentations today as well. From a sector perspective, we've seen
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, a great thanks to IIC and Asha Impact for having us here. Really good and interesting discussions going on for the last 2 years, and something that happened in the last hour or so in this room is a good reflection of how blended finance is being seen in the country and how it's gaining in importance, not between the peer group that's sitting in this room, but also at the Government of India level, with the Finance Minister talking about it in the budget speech last year to a couple of days back, again coming up with a statement. And in between also a lot of things happening. Samrit, which as Aparna mentioned has been a facility that got created a couple of years back, looking at blended finance specifically in the healthcare space, was initiated in terms of discussion starting just a week before the first lockdown happened. It was exactly March 22nd that we were sitting with USAID and National Health Authority trying to understand where the government's thinking was with the global pandemic and what challenges they perceived and how the development institutions like USAID would come in and support that. And that was where the 2 points that came out from across the table at that time, Dr. Indu Bhushan, kind of kept us thinking for a week or so that what possible solution could exist, and we came up with blended finance. Those two challenges were basically that it was kind of very clear that the lockdown is going to happen in a few days. Indications were there from the global ecosystem, as well as Government of India was also thinking on similar lines. And the challenge that it was going to throw was twofold. One was that the healthcare infrastructure is going to be under a lot of pressure, and at the same time their normal sources of income through their usual business would kind of stop. On the other hand, it was also a realization that India was not prepared at all for such kind of a lockdown, to kind of cater to such kind of a pandemic. We didn't have even manufacturing capacity for simple things like PPEs. Everything was being imported. Leave out the other kind of innovations that would be required to address the pandemic. So looking at these two things, one point that came out was that to enable both our existing healthcare enterprises and facilities at different levels, as well as the new age companies or the new age companies who are trying to kind of come up with innovative, quick solutions, you will require access to affordable capital so that they can scale up their operations in a quick and efficient manner. It was very clear that government would be focusing on the public health space, and for them to kind of divert a capital to support the private sector may be difficult. And the development finance institutions may also not be able to bring in enough capital to address the challenge. And that kind of became the genesis, that with whatever capital that was coming from the development institutions, how we can kind of encourage more and more private capital to come in. And that kind of formed the genesis for setting up the Samrit Healthcare Blended Finance Facility. Over the next few months, it became more of a platform, gathered both stakeholders together, the other government institutions like the Niti Aayog and the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor joined in. We got partnerships from the financial institutions and all. And I would like to kind of like to kind of take you through the experience that we have had over the last couple of years with this facility. The challenges still remain the same, even though COVID has now passed. For the facility, the health system strengthening challenge and making the country prepared for the next pandemic kind of still resonates, and still the access to affordable capital is something the healthcare enterprises in the country require. So how does this facility work, or what does it try to do? Basically, it tries to bring together the three sectors: the government, the private sector, and the investment space, be it from the public side or the private side. And it basically brings these partners together on a platform to enable combination of philanthropic capital with the commercial capital, and in a way ensure that healthcare enterprises which have a social cause at the end of their mind are able to kind of scale up their operations in an efficient manner. And the challenge that it tries to kind of address on the other end of the spectrum is basically bridging the supply side gap. The demand for healthcare services is there across the country, but the supply has been inefficient in the past. People have huge out-of-pocket expenditure, but still don't get affordable quality care on the ground. So the focus has been to kind of bring these aspects together using blended finance as an instrument. How the facility is structured is quite interesting, because there was a realization based on the global experience as well as experience within the country that to get any kind of a blended solution come to play is a time-consuming task. You have multiple stakeholders, getting them all together on a table becomes a huge task. You have to set the M&E systems, you have to measure the impact end of the day, and especially the pandemic didn't give us that kind of a leeway that spend that much time. So what we decided from the very beginning was that we will use a pooled approach and pre-commitment approach to kind of address the challenge. And what we did with IP Global acting as a technical support unit with USAID support at the center was focus on two sides of the problem. One was raising the philanthropic capital, which largely came initially from the likes of USAID, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, Mofo Foundation, and of late has also started coming from the Indian corporate social responsibility pool. Soumya from 361 Foundation will be talking about one such initiative that was carried out. And on the other side, we also got pre-commitments from the financial institutions. We were lucky to get initial partners like IndusInd Bank and Caspian Debt, but later on Axis Bank, HDFC Bank, and many more kind of joined the group. Overall, the facility with these two pools of capital, with around $30 to $40 million of grant capital and close to $250 million of commercial capital, gave us the opportunity to have overall $300 million plus kind of a commitment to quickly deploy. And that we did over the last 2.5 years using different instruments. And what we realized was that no one single kind of a recipe exists which fits the requirements of the healthcare enterprises. So we have kind of used multiple kind of instruments, from risk guarantees to zero coupon loans, returnable grants, to collateral financing, to interest subventions and social success notes. And in many times for a particular entity, even if it's a small entity, multiple instruments being used in a combination to kind of address their issues. We also set up a very strong kind of a governance mechanism for this facility, because you are dealing with philanthropic money after all, and so the advisory committee, which consists of leading people from the government as well as from the scientific community, are part of the advisory committee to kind of govern the overall structure. In the last 2 years, we have kind of invested in 60 plus healthcare solutions, and they kind of pan across the country. They have ranged from medtech devices to AI, machine learning based solutions to supply chain solutions, primary healthcare providers, secondary healthcare providers, as well as tertiary healthcare providers. And at the bottom of it has also been that how these India-based solutions or Make in India solutions can provide affordable care to the last mile. Just to give you a few examples, some of the innovations that we have supported have brought down the cost of equipment, for example. as much as 70 to 80% from what we were importing. And India imports medical devices. Unlike pharma products which we export, medical devices has been a huge import burden on the country and a big problem for tier 2, tier 3 town health facilities to procure high-end machines. So now we are talking about a 12-lead ECG, which is a pocket kind of a device costing less than $100, as compared to anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 that otherwise one would have to spend. To innovations like bubble CPAPs, to hand crank defib machines, one of its kind globally. So I'm saying the ecosystem always was there. It was just that it required the affordable capital being available for them to come out of the light. Just to take you through a few examples of how we use blended finance for this. So BlackFrog Technologies is a backpack vaccine carrier for last mile delivery of vaccines. Now when we kind of started interacting with them, their biggest challenge was they were getting a lot of traction from the market, but their manufacturing capacity was not there. They were hardly could manufacture 10 to 20 devices in a month, where the demand was in hundreds. Even if they were somehow able to set up their manufacturing capacity, they didn't have the capacity to service these orders, because to kind of purchase the raw material was a big challenge for them. And above all, they were first generation entrepreneurs, and they didn't have any kind of collateral to provide to the banks and financial institutions to provide them the financing. So in this particular case, we used mere $200,000 to kind of leverage $1 million for this entity, which enabled them to kind of set up their manufacturing capacity, cater to their orders, and as well as kind of go internationally. Now they're also providing services to, or their instruments to counties in Kenya and other African countries. The instruments we had to use for all this was to start with a partial risk guarantee, which could enable them to get a loan to a certain extent from an NBFC. Now, given that they could get a loan from an NBFC, the interest rate was pretty high. For them to be able to pay back that interest rate was not possible, at least in the initial phases of their business. So we used an interest subvention instrument to kind of bring down the interest cost for them. And still we felt there was a gap which, in terms of the financing requirement that they had and what was on the table. So we also provided them a returnable grant. Now within a year, this entity has been able to pay back, not only pay back the loan that they have been paying as per the schedule, they have also started paying the returnable grant. So that's the power of blended finance for an early stage startup without any kind of collateral or anything to kind of take forward things. One thing that I about are not possible in the normal course of life. So we were lucky, and we kind of worked across the governments to kind of see how it could be worked out, and partnered with IIT Delhi, which acts as the fund hosting entity for us. And besides bringing their technical kind of knowledge and mentoring support, they also kind of help us in structuring many of these instruments as per the regulatory requirements in the country. Now, we were doing these kind of case-to-case interventions, but and said, like, doing this kind of a deal once this facility was structured still took a couple of months' time. Now, what we realized was that even at this space was not enough, and we had to kind of fast-track things much more. And that's where we got into portfolio-level structures. We started with, again, Caspian debt with a portfolio-level social success note, which was a smaller kind of a proof of concept facility where we provided capital of close to $300,000, which enabled a loan book of 20 crores or $2.5 million. But the bigger kind of thing came up with Axis Bank coming on board and committing $150 million for the facility from their end. Now we have been running the social success note with them, the first phase of which, where from our pool of grant funding or philanthropic funding, we have committed $2.5 million close to, which will enable a loan book of $35 million or so. So basically 20 crores of philanthropic money leading to 400 crores of loan book to social enterprises across the ecosystem that I talked about. We would be supporting close to 20 plus entities and hoping to get a 15 to 20x leverage in this particular.
I'm sure all of us have learned a lot from it, especially when you spoke about how the existing infrastructure could be leveraged to mainstream capital into this vast space. So you made a point about this blended finance having the need to have empirical data and studies basically backing it for us to understand how one could use this understanding to scale up these opportunities, both from public as well as private finance, which we thought is a very relevant point, especially at this point when we are looking at understanding the entire transaction history that's taken place. So really glad to inaugurate the report today, which is the first of its kind, a comprehensive chronicling of the entire blended finance transaction history in India spanning more than a decade. So sir, if you could please inaugurate the report.
What is this protocol?
Just open it. Just open it.
Just open it. Come.
The analysis has been carried out. So this database, to which so many of you have very graciously contributed to, carries the complete comprehensive listing of all the transactions of blended finance which have taken place over close to 13 years in India. This database continues to be available on the website that we just spoke about. We'll continue to update this, and this is the resource that any of you all can refer to going ahead to understand the nature of innovation that's happening in this space, the kind of transactions that have come out. So we promise we promise that this will be a really, really interesting resource to refer to at any point.
You got to inaugurate our report for us, Mr. Singh, but with that, please join me in thanking Mr. Singh for taking the time to
understand what are those trend analysis, what are those points that have emerged. So I'd like to invite Ms. Aparna Dua, Director, Asha Impact Trust, to share the learnings and the findings with us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Divya. I think I'd just like to add a quick point. I think the report only has, I like to refer to it as a new cup. Once you drive out of it, it kind of loses its value. But what we're really excited about as well is, the bedrock of the report, which is this database, and we really hope with your effort, we can continue to keep updating this as a live entity. And create more data-backed conversations around blended finance, and that's really sort of the genesis of the report why Asha and IIC undertook this venture as well. So let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Aparna, and I head Asha Impact Trust. We're part of the Asha Group. We have our sister entity, Asha Ventures. Asha was set up by Vikram Gandhi and Pramod Bhasin back in 2014. The trust particularly as a think tank for the development finance space to catalyze impact investment and blended finance. We also work with the government and civil society organizations closely on some of the issues which are either policy bottlenecks or market bottlenecks in areas such as education, skilling, entrepreneurship, and urban development. So I'm not going to get into what blended finance is. We've kind of spoken about that, but I think it's important to highlight, why we thought now was the opportune time for a report and a database like this. Vikram and Mr. Ramaji, spoke about the trillions of dollars that are required to meet the climate financing goals, the SDGs as well. 2.6 trillion is just one of these estimates, and obviously it's gone up incrementally since the pandemic. As of one estimate, it's almost 2 trillion higher. Now is the time we're talking about co-opting more commercial capital into towards meeting some of these development objectives. So blended finance, as Ramraj also touched upon, is not really new per se as a concept, but it has started to gain traction as economies have woken up to this dire need to actually co-opt some of this commercial capital. And philanthropic capital, ODA, government spending, is not really enough, it's not really measuring up to the kind of need that we're talking about in terms of financing. We've seen some of this mentioned, as Mr. Amarjit also talked about, in the G20 Sustainable Finance Agenda. It's making its way into the budget speech as well as of last year, where the finance minister talked about thematic funds for blended finance, again to mobilize capital in areas such as agri, healthcare, wash, etc. And that's really why we felt now was the right time catalyze a report such as this, as well as a data source which is open source. It's a public good that we're creating. We've now put together about 180 transactions. Some of them have been condensed into a few transactions with similar structures. But we hope with your effort, we can continue to grow this. And a heartfelt thanks to everyone in this room who've contributed their time to the surveys as well as the transaction details that we requested you for. So coming to defining blended finance, there are multiple multiple definitions that we looked at, but a lot of these converge in factors of concessionality, leverage, as well as additionality of impact. So this is the framework that we've used specifically for the report to objectively sort of classify what constitutes blended finance and doesn't. Through our interviews, we realized that even people who were familiar with the term felt that there was a need to have a common framework that we could use to start talking about this. So that's another endeavor that this report has put forward, is to create a framework that can now be used going forward to really look at what constitutes blended finance and what doesn't. Very quickly, impact, that's very straightforward, but in our conversations and as we went through the multiple transactions that we were looking at, we've seen a variety of rigor when we are looking at transactions on impact reporting. So on one end of the spectrum, we had results-based financing instruments, and on the others, much larger scale concessional debt and guarantee structures, which were obviously creating the desired impact, but the rigor of measurement may have varied. Leverage is one of the very critical aspects of blended finance as we talk, because we're talking about mobilizing additional commercial or return-seeking capital. Catalytic or concessional capital, just looking for clear factors of concessionality, whether it's returns on a risk-adjusted basis or favorable terms or the role of market making. And then returns, blended finance transactions at the core do have positive financial returns, and that can vary from concessional to market rate returns. And then lastly, time frame, which we're looking at a transaction of a given time frame, for the transaction itself. Setup of some of these facilities as well. With guarantees, I think there's a lot more room that one can see a much higher leverage, but this is also based on conservative estimates where we've assumed that the entire guarantee amount has been set aside for the purpose, but in actual practice it could be a much smaller fraction, so the leverage could actually look almost maybe 15-20 times. So coming to the key issues that have been identified by stakeholders, and we spoke to commercial capital providers, concessional capital providers, as well as service providers. I think some of these were already touched upon by Vikram and Mr. Ramanjeet. There's been lack of awareness broadly in this space. So people don't know about the blended finance structures. There's often the understanding that blending is simply taking a grant and then kind of adding that to other structures. There has been a lack of track record in terms of impact, as well as the financial returns that some of these structures have actually given back. And we're hoping with the database, we will start adding some of these layers of data on top of that as well to drive more conversations and create more awareness. The cost and time of structuring have also been highlighted as one of the key concerns from stakeholders. And of course, the regulatory and legal issues, specifically from a standpoint of philanthropic capital, how do you really work together with commercial capital?
As two very different things. The need is very different, the scale is very different, the kind of players who get involved are very different. We've never used terms like Bill Benson if it comes to for-profit entities. And I suspect that out of the 5.6 billion that Aparna referred to, perhaps 80 to 90% of that capital would have gone to for-profit entities, right? So are we trying to sort of package in too much within this one term of blended finance, where the flavors are just so very different that I simply, with my limited understanding, can't see them coming together.
Trying to think about what's the most appropriate answer or response to that, but I do agree that over a period of time, if you have to simplify things, you will have to narrow it down at some level. I mean, it's very difficult for us to do a one-size-fits-all. And also it's very difficult then to showcase the value proposition to the government, and it's not an easy sort of a pitch. So it will have to, over a period of time, yes, I would agree. But any other perspectives?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, but it's also in terms of, almost like a demo. I would say that if you're talking about big SIPs and which, the CSR grants or any grant for that matter, philanthropic grants or anything, they can be used very effectively till you find a solution that yes, then it can be commercially upscaled. But if you ask me at this point of time, it's better to say, because it's not going to work. We've tried in many cases. We've not had much success in terms of, we've had success in terms of, working on something for a long period and then it becoming mainstream. But there will be some sectors where you may find better success, like climate. Because there your players are slightly different from, your traditional non-profits to, organizations who are working on climate. So there can be a sector approach as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please.
So I actually look at it as, it would be great to simplify it, but you actually have the financing options and you have the financing instruments.
Yeah.
And you've got to look at it through those two lenses. Because the financing options are going to be your concessional capital, your result-based financing, your risk mitigation, and so forth. And on the financing instruments, you're going to have a fund structure, you're going to have a bond structure, and so forth. So I would look at it really across these two lenses and then try and figure out who is the investor or who is the participant for each of these boxes that I've actually created and try to simplify at that level.
No, that's a great point. If I may just add something, I think the only one pool of capital that everybody is looking with a lot of interest, but where there is no clarity around, at least my mind, as to how that pool can be used for-profit enterprises, is the CSR. Right? So all of the pools of capital, absolutely concessional, fully commercial. But what do we do with CSR money, and how do we use that to create blended finance where for-profit entities are beneficiaries is, I suppose, still a big enigma for a lot of people. I mean, I know things are evolving, but I don't think we've got it there.
You need much better regulatory kind of transparency and just guidelines in terms of what that CSR money can be used for. And I think once we have that, that will just unlock really the capital that we're looking to in much, much larger numbers.
So I just want to give an example of something that we are working on, which kind of probably goes against what you've been saying. It's a combination of both commercial capital as well as foundation capital. So obviously the pooling vehicle, we understand AIFs, so like a hammer and nail thing, we all do everything with an alternate investment fund structure. But the flexibility that it provides, so there is a junior tranche, which is foundation capital. And my colleague Amrita is working on that one. Whoever has more questions can reach out to her after this. Gives anywhere from 0 to 4% as your return. So it's a subsidized return, but you do get the capital back, which is also a kind of a push factor for a foundation or for a CSR focused kind of capital provider. Then there is commercial capital that comes in. So the entire fund size would be the pool of about $50 million or $100 million. It is giving to enterprises at a concessional rate at what they would borrow in the market. But the beauty is not just that it is concessional, because everybody would be ready for just say 2% lower kind of fee that they would get. In return for that 2%, there is a lot more reporting. There is pilots that they have to consider. So for example, if it is a microfinance company, you will have to ensure that there is a skilling program on financial literacy at the pool level, at the borrowers that you are lending to. There is also the push for doing a new kind of product, right? Because a company only knows one kind of product which it can scale. But suppose a group lending loan, which is a microfinance loan, is not as well suited for an area where somebody wants an entrepreneur loan which is maybe 50% larger than what a group loan gives and is for a particular industry. Maybe might be mahua trees and you're making towards tribal folks. So certain pilots, technical assistance, those are the aspects on which the company is forced to report in return for that concession capital. The size of the capital is meaningful enough that they would go through the problems of dealing with all their asks for getting a check size of $3 to $10 million. That only comes in when you also bring in commercial capital, which is coming in at a higher return, but that is being subsidized by the foundation bill. So a mix like this really works in terms of getting the scale and also is in line with what probably a foundation might want to do. And this is something that we are in advanced stages of actually rolling out.
No, foundation, absolutely. I think the question was CSR money. How do you bring in CSR money?
CSR,
Foundation is quite common.
For an alternate investment fund itself, the CSR can't take money because I have to give something in return, which is a unit.
That is the key question.
The only way mirror will be, I mean, 2 points, which is one is that you need a aggregating vehicle of some strong institutional character. Okay, that is the first thing. Exactly. Second is you have to have a certain high quality, rigorous social audit, which at some level has to be converted into some kind of a social unit, social impact unit. It can be sectoral. Initially, it may not be that we can mix up agriculture with health. But even if I create social finance sort of impact unit across say 5 or 6 sectors based on some rigorous social audit standard, then depending on whether it's a commercial investor, it's a CSR investor, it's a philanthropy, it's a commercial, you can get some combination of financial return come social impact. Something like that, if we can create which is really, and that cannot be done. I mean, you guys will do a fantastic job, it will be something private, but if you really want it at scale, it will have to be some kind of a organization which has, I mean, you could think of it like a equivalent of an NSDC or an Invest India, some quasi-private public combination. If you really want to catalyze that market is the way, and you will have complexity at the back end, but the front end will be relatively very simple. No one is going to lose their job for putting their money there. Fundamentally, to me, that is the first condition of CSR and other people, because that is what makes their life simple. Today, if they put their money in the Prime Minister's this thing, it's something which is allowed. So some of these things will have to develop. I think we are going to we're just going to take one last question and then we're going to ask Aparna to join us for closing remarks. Please. You have a mic there? Yes.
Your combined views. So 3 inputs on getting the skills. I had the NSE social stock exchange business and we are interacting with NPOs and with Rachna is here. In fact, that's why we're here. 3 inputs. One, the scale will come from the large scale outcome funders, and which could be the government only, no one else. Let's acknowledge it. And we have to build capacity on that side also, and which we are doing at our level. So, second input is, I think the mindset change of NPOs with non-profit organization. I think if you see the last 50 years of entire segment, who joins the NGOs, who are not driven by the outputs, outcomes. Free life, easy life, they are getting grants, they are working. There are many good NGOs which are working on outcomes, output, but this is business, this is not business. This is profit, this is not profit. Profit, if you like to measure profit, go to business. If I like to do some charity, social. So now, first time, and third point which I am coming to is, which is very important, because I had myself an impact founder. The VC space, the commercial VC has now taken over the impact VC space, Now, when I was an impact founder, because I had a solar company, it has 2 components, purpose and profit. I was making decent PAT, that's a 7%, which was not happy. Commercial VC was not happy to fund me because my PAT is very low. But when I used to talk about carbon emission and CR and other purpose, so they put a measurable impact instrument and then I got the funding. That's why 65% success is in energy and financial instruments, because both are measurable areas, and impact founders are delivering there. Now we're talking about government money which is in social space going to NPO which are in social space. Measurement is a big issue, everybody knows it. I'm nothing new I'm talking here. So till the time NPO think about giving the output and outcome, so we need capacity building, I understand this. So again, I'm repeating for the sake of repeating, 3 things can build the skill. What Raj said that, institutional mechanism where government and private can come together and government can become the last of outcome funder first. Second, mindset change of NPO that they have to give outcome. If they need now larger scale funding, they need to give outcome. And third, which is very, very important, is risk measurement, organization impact measurement, defined metrics. You can systemize by the regulators. These are 3 key things. Thank you very much.
Not-for-profit side, sir, I think what you are trying to communicate actually is the rigor of impact measurement. I think general people are good, their hearts are in the right place and they are doing it. Possibly the rigor of impact measurement for a capital market instrument is where maybe there is a gap which has to be bridged. But I'd say that that's something which definitely we need to work on. But and I think, as you rightly said, the institutional character is something we need. Otherwise, this is definitely not going to scale. But yes, I think the way you sharply differentiated between the commercial and the not-for-profit, sir, I think there are some gaps in the not-for-profit, but then there will be some gaps on the commercial side also. So I think, you know, I'd like to sort of see this comment in a slightly more holistic way. But any comments from others before we close?
I do have a comment. Yeah. I think, you know, one of the things because I've worked with non-profits now for a very long time, I think it's the most difficult job of the world.
Yeah.
It's not easy because, you know, we sit on the other side, we say, because we give money, we say this is our project, please finish. We don't think, and I'm just telling you, take COVID. Your project is on and many of our partners call to say that, you know, now I don't have money to pay my salaries. You know, nobody's looking at it. They're saying that COVID hai, the project is not getting implemented, but they're not thinking that it's like an institution. And then at the end of it, you want a report of the best quality. You want them to, so, you know, one has to understand the non-profit sector. There's a cost attached to it. You know, we are from the other side. We talk about cost when we are talking about our stuff. If you're looking at an institution as a non-profit who's going to deliver as per your commercial requirement, you have to build capacity. You also have to think of the cost. That's something we can't go with. We just can't say this is with the existing cost, you deliver what we are wanting to do. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be very tough. So I think from the other side, we really have to think about it.
I just wanted to make one point, not about the NPOs but about the CSR sector, because I think that at least what we do at our foundation, we are held to far stricter outcomes in the foundation than with business. That I can vouch for with confidence. And every penny which is put in, the scale of it is measured, whether it is in education, wash sector, skilling, or gender development. The multiplier is very clearly defined, and what impact is required to be achieved for every money that goes into CSR, and ensuring that there's arm's length with the bank is very, very strict. So I think this, it would be unfair to say that CSR teams are not being held accountable for the multiplication they're doing in this sector.
And Sohini, you'll agree with me that all board members have very animated views on the CSR efforts of the organization. Whether they are as much animated on the corporate affairs of the organization, they all have very strong views on all the multifaceted ways in which the CSR money can be used.
So CSR teams are definitely held accountable in today's world, and the funds are going into use.
Great. I think we'll kind of, I'm sure, we can continue this conversation, even after the end of this panel. So, Divya, over to you to carry the conversation forward. Maybe Aparna, closing remarks from your side.
Time, and I think one of the things which Rohini said is very important. It's, I think awareness. You have to understand that CSR is becoming more compliance today. And the fact is, you have the board which takes the decision. So I think at that level, I think a lot of awareness in terms of the board knowing that what it is, I think that's going to be very important, and that's how it's going to go. Today it's very ad hoc, I'll be very honest with you. Currently, I think maybe with all the conversation that's happening, I'm not too pessimistic. I think it's going to go somewhere because we've seen progress. If you see the microfinance sector in itself, it's a case study. Because if you see the microfinance sector, it started with non-profits to NBFCs to now small banks, many of them. So it's not that it's not possible, but yes, the timeline is much higher. There's a lot of conversation going on, and we do see people, and I think there is another thing perhaps which will kind of scale this, because if you're talking about scale and speed, I think private partnership will have to play a much larger role, but it's not as easy as I am telling you. It's a lot of things. It's a combination of a lot of things, but I think compliance is definitely playing a very important role. Compliance and awareness, I would put it in these things. I also spoke about capacity, because it's easier, but even when you're talking about an outcome fund, he was working on a scale impact bond, but even the service providers, for example, if you have NGOs who are service providers, right, in this entire impact bond structure. Even for them, there has to be a lot of capacity building there as well. So it's, if you ask me, it's more a journey. I don't see it happening very rapidly, but having said so, I think if we invest in another few years, we should be in some state at least. That's what I think.
Specifically on DIBs for family offices, firstly, family offices, as far as their philanthropy or impact is concerned, it does tend to be quite personal. So the spaces in which they operate they're quite defined. So there'll be some would say education, some would say healthcare, and so forth. So one is to be able to match the DIB which is available with the personal preference of the family, and it's not always that you get something which they associate with. So that's one small constraint. The other, I think, is really the complexity of how a DIB works, which can be quite challenging to explain to a family so that they understand all the moving parts. Are they the risk investor? Are they the outcome funder? What exactly are we measuring? Does it then fit into the family values? I think there are just so many levels that you need to look at. But I found that in our dealings with clients, it's tended to be more on the complexity of how it will work than anything else. So if we can simplify things a bit to Ravi's point, can you create a fund? It's very easy. You just put the money in, and then it's, in some ways, you've forgotten about it till you get the money back, or you hope you get the money back. But whatever it is, it's much simpler to understand. So can we simplify the structures for individuals and family offices to participate?
I think I'll just take a quick moment firstly to thank all of you for generously giving us your time today. I hope you found all the conversations here, right from the fireside chat to the report findings, to the panel discussion, to the case studies, very fascinating. And we've tried to highlight and bring together different aspects of this, right from what say a 361 Foundation is doing with CSR to what Samrit has catalyzed, to all the interesting observations that Ravi, Sohini, Aloka, and Soumya brought to the table. This is just the beginning. We're just starting out the conversations, and as Asha and IIC, I think we couldn't be more glad that some of these conversations are now going to be backed by examples, by data. So thank you once again for joining us today, and would invite all of you to to tea and coffee and snacks outside and continue the conversations from this afternoon. We are going to have the QR code for the report up as well, and as Divya mentioned, it's only going to be up for a couple of hours. So fastest fingers first. Thank you all for joining us.
We're not giving out hard copies, just anyone who wants it can download it. It's just the interest of not cutting trees and just being more sustainable. That's all. It's not anything else. Thank you.
Mention about the DIB, it's a little bit more challenging than those other structures. So any thoughts on that? And on unlocking capital as an intermediate thing, the vast potential of CSR, we've got wonderful CSR representatives here. I'm sorry if it sounds blunt, but the question is, why aren't more CSRs doing that? Right? There's evidence, many people say there's reg issues, some people say it's to be channeled to incubators, to utilization certificate. So very bluntly, why are more CSRs not putting the money in? It would make it easier for HNIs and others to do so. Impact bonds for projects for an NGO, or essentially what would it take? What are some of the barriers?
So let me mention, apart from zero coupon, zero principal, you also have social impact funds. We also have development impact bonds. They're not being much talked about, but one could participate through those alternate instruments also which are available. When you say the pooling kind of structures, so I think, are you referring to a fund structure?
No, it's not like a DIB only, but what is the barrier to getting NGOs to start actually using and listing some of those instruments, the 10 and the 8 that have started to register?
So, for the purpose of listing on the exchange, we have certain thresholds. And again, there was a lot of debate what should be those thresholds, because we are used to very high numbers, and we started with those numbers. We had to bring it down. We were told by experts, look, this will not fly at all. So, so let me try and recall what the exact numbers are for the purpose of listing or registration. I think it is 1 crore perhaps, and some 2 years track record, and also your commitment to make all disclosures on the exchange. But so that you can always check on our website. I think the important point is that we should be open to more instruments. And people like you can brainstorm and tell us what more needs to be done. Because definitely this, to my mind at least, it has potential for a variety of instruments, a variety of structures, and our challenge would be we would like some mainstreaming to happen. Some vanilla instrument like 0-2-1-0 principle with the promise of social return. Perhaps this could be one.
Yeah, I think that the question, maybe, and while somebody else is thinking of their question, is the, so if you've got these 18, the 10 and the 8, I mean, the non-profits are always trying to raise money. So the question really is that why haven't they actually listed and started raising money on the exchange? They've registered, but is there any impediment for them to doing that?
No, there's no impediment. I suppose they are eligible to raise money. It's just a question of another leap of faith on their part. But even the registration, I will like to compliment them because they are really committing themselves to a lot more than by not registering there. So I think it's a huge signaling effect. So if you are registered there, you have the potential to attract more capital than those who are not registered there. And also, the incentive structure is like this. Incentive would be you make certain disclosures, you make certain commitments, and you are measured against your commitments. If you do well, your ability to leverage that in terms of your ability to raise more money multiplies. If you fail, then people will not give you money. CSR is a valid suggestion. That's what the committee also recommended. We've been discussing it with the government, and we also feel some of the funds can be channelized to give it a bit of more traction. But decision lies with the government.
Please be seated. On behalf of the Impact Investors Council and the Asha Impact Trust, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you. My name is Divya and I am part of the IIC team. We really appreciate you having taken out the time to come today for the launch of the first ever complete landscape report on blended finance transactions in India. We will also be proceeding to the formal launch of the Blended Finance website, where you get to see the repository of all the content and all the resources of everything that you've ever wanted to learn in this space. As you can see on the screen, we have a lot in store for us today. We start off with Mr. Ramraj Pai, CEO IIC, sharing his opening remarks. We then move into a very interesting fireside chat with Mr. Vikram Gandhi and Mr. Amarjit Singh, sharing their thoughts on the future of social finance. Post which we move into the launch of the report and the website. More on this we will speak as we go along. This will be followed by a session on understanding what are the findings, the learnings that we've had from the entire report, presented by Ms. Aparna Dua, Director, Asha Impact Trust. This would be followed by two very interesting case studies which give us a complete ground-up understanding of what's really been happening behind the scene for the implementation of such transactions. And then we close the event with a panel discussion speaking about scaling of blended finance going ahead. So we're very glad to bring together this session for you. I would like to request Ramraj to just take on the stage.
What is the incentive for them to go through the social stock exchange? Why can't they just simply give the money to these enterprises as a grant?
A good question. Idea, if you ask me to what it boils down to, is the greater transparency. So you are assured of certain disclosures which are mandated by regulator, and those disclosures are also quantitative in nature, which are measurable. And not only that, we have gone beyond that those disclosures have to be audited by a third party, by a social auditor. So that you will not perhaps get unless you are a big donor and you have a bilateral contract with the donee. Then you can call them every day and ask what you're doing. Other than that, if you are a small investor, then this is, you have a, just like you can check today which company is doing what by going to the stock exchange and see whatever the material issues are, everything is disclosed. So the same structures would be at play.
Okay, one last question guys before we...
For us, we have a very strong in-house monitoring team that looks at impact numbers, as well as third-party impact monitoring agencies who are kind of independently looking at the impact numbers and reporting them. As Aparna had mentioned, we have kind of also within the facility used a number of improvements from risk guarantees to result-based financing, etc. But I think still the facility with $300 million remains a drop in the ocean, and there is much more to be achieved as we move forward. The facility has got some global recognition also, specifically from the perspective of getting the partners together. We have 100+ partners coming from academia, incubators, to banks, financial institutions, to private equity players, as well as the government and the private sector enterprises. And we were kind of won the P3 Impact Award given by the State Department last year. The first Indian kind of facility to win that award, and were also recognized by
Sure, we have about half a minute left now.
So I am also done. So, great. So pleasure connecting with all of you today, and look forward to kind of your support also as we move forward for the facility. And thanks again for IIC and to Asha Impact for the continued partnership.
Very fascinating.
Thank you. First of all, thanks Ramraj and thanks Vikram for having me in this important conversation. I think Ramraj at a high level said it all. He gave a very nice high level summary of where we are. And
that's why he's our CEO.
Yeah. We've got a great guy there. So, coming to your question, Vikram, I think there are many moving parts. If you, as Ramraj rightly pointed out, first of all, it's very clear that for sustainable finance, India needs a lot of funds. And there are various estimates that if you want to reach net zero, you need $10 trillion according to one assessment. There are various assessments. So clearly we know what we are into, but we don't have visibility on how that funding gap would be met. If you look at the global state of play, so it's been on the agenda of G20, various meetings year after year. It's there under our presidency also. Climate finance is one of the high priorities. Apart from other social inclusion, financial inclusion, and so on. So I think the world leaders are definitely putting it high on their discussions, high on the agenda. But I guess the implementation, there are apparently gaps, and that's where I think the new structures, we need to think of new structures. And so far, in most of the countries we've been used to, when it comes to finance, so we look at state and the markets. State would also mean public sector, markets would also mean private sector. Generally, the interplay of these two actors in terms of financing. But I think there is apparently a third way to look at how the new financing needs can be met through some innovative thinking and some innovative structures and solutions. And that's what we try to do in our social stock exchange initiative. But maybe we can talk about that later. So, also, there is a geopolitics around it. So, for example, developing world has been telling the developed world, look, we were not responsible for these emissions. So, India has 17% population of the world, but our claim is that we contributed only 4% over many decades. So, we need financing, and if you are asking us to cut down emissions today, and it's a very valid sort of argument. And there was a commitment from the developed world, I think that was made way back in 2009, that $100 billion every year would be provided, but we don't see that happening, right? So there are definitely gaps, and I think we have to find both domestic as well as international solutions at the global level. We need to keep this talk on. If I can just digress a little bit, we've been engaging on the disclosures with ISSB, ISO, and so on. So our emphasis has been that, so there the focus largely is on climate-related disclosures, not so much on S and G as we would like, and we feel, so the template that we developed, and I was very closely engaged in that as well. So our approach has been, we need climate plus approach, just not the climate, because our realities are different from the developed world. So, so we've been asking for, some proportionality in case you have a global baseline of disclosures. There should be an element of proportionality, flexibility, and just and fair transition. And you should agree for a common roadmap. It should not, you should not treat everybody at the same level at a given point of time, because different countries are, different jurisdictions are at different stages of development. So let me come back to sustainable finance. So they're talking more about within India, and I can talk with some confidence about what SEBI has been doing. So we have several touch points. One is, of course, the area of disclosures, and maybe we can talk about that in more detail. Then we have the some new instruments in the form of green bonds, and we need more traction there. We've also talked about yellow bonds, blue bonds, and so on. Then we are also concerned with the mis-selling, not being true to the label, the greenwashing, so-called greenwashing. So also another important area that we are dealing with is the ESG ratings. So need a real regulatory framework around that. Similarly, RBI has its own framework. Then Government of India came out with a sovereign green bond issuance, I think 16,000 crore last year. So what I'm trying to say, both at the government level and at the regulators level, SEBI and RBI mainly, I think this is clearly an area of focus, area of high priority, and I would probably think in many aspects we are ahead of many other jurisdictions when we compare in terms of having various disclosures, assurance, and so on requirements. But maybe I can talk about that. Sorry, a long answer.
No, this is great. This is wonderful. So let's talk about that actually, because it's a very important thing. Because if you think of the tools, the idea is that okay, we have to channel more capital into sustainability, and again, for the sake of argument, let's focus on the climate issue for one. So if we have to channel more capital into that, there are kind of multiple ways to do it, right? Or multiple kind of things which need to come in place. One is you actually tax people who emit, right? So that's one. Two is you create incentives for companies and governments and industries to actually invest in certain areas. And so it's basically incentives for capital allocation, right? The third is that you create good disclosure, like you're saying, which then, basically you measure as a unit, you get what you measure. So if you create the right kind of disclosure, investors, I would say that as I talk to investors globally and at HBS, at Harvard Business School, when most investors who are reasonably long-term, and I'm not talking about asset managers, because asset managers are somewhat more shorter term, but the actual asset owners. So if you think about who actually owns the assets, even in the Indian context, it's pension plans, insurance companies, family individuals and family offices. And if you think about savings in their sovereign wealth funds, if you think about savings in that context, people, when they talk about a quarter, right, typically people say, short-term thinking, 90 days, quarter and all that. When they talk about quarter, they're talking about 25 years. And so therefore for them, actually there's so much systemic risk in their portfolios that, particularly from climate, that if investors and companies and the government doesn't deal with it, ultimately their portfolio value is going to go down. So there's an inbuilt mechanism right now to make that happen. So in the Indian context, we've seen the same kind of pressure from investors that we need this disclosure, we want this disclosure. So that'd be from the investor side. And then what we see, at least in the US, is there's resistance on the part of companies, especially again if we talk about climate, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Oh well, we can't do this, we can't do that. Where do we stand on that? Because I know you all have come up with that the top 1,000 companies need to disclose, etc. So where do we stand on that?
So to answer your first question, so clearly in the ESG world there have been two driving forces world over, and the first and the more potent force has been the investors, to my mind. In fact, investors have driven the change, and if I may say, regulators have been behind the curve. I'm not saying that for SEBI, but
SEBI is always ahead of the curve, we know that.
So I think investors have definitely been a driving force in terms of forcing companies to look at non-financial reporting, look at environment, climate considerations and so on. Whether that has played out in India, I would say not as much as one would like to see, but things are changing. So my sense is there is a greater investor consciousness around ESG issues in Europe, because that's what the numbers suggest. And if you look at Morningstar data, in terms of the assets under management, ESG assets under management actually, they've tripled from 2020 to 2023. It used to be less than $1 trillion. Today it is close to $2.7 trillion. I need to see the data. Just give me a second.
You talk about in India or globally?
No, globally. So so USD 900 billion at the end of March 2020. Yeah, I'm correct. USD 2.7 trillion at the end of March 2023. So if you look at the share of Europe in this, it is 84%. And Asia is, I think, less than 10%, but I need to double check. Yeah, Asia is just 3% and US is 11%. So this data itself shows you, the investor push in Europe is at very high vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So here, and also there's another important sort of element here which we can bring in now. As a regulator, we are agnostic. We don't say that you invest in ESG or non-ESG. I mean, it's none of our business. All that we are here to do is, you as an investor, if you want to invest in ESG schemes or sustainable companies, you should have the right information, right disclosure to take your call. That's all, so we don't want to go beyond that. Now, as an investor, so my psyche is, look, this whole talk of climate, social equity, etc. is great, but what about the financial returns? So am I willing to compromise on that? So I think that's where I think we need little more empirical studies, and my understanding is there are studies on both sides. Some studies show that if you're investing in an ESG company over a medium to long term, so they notified it as a security. Now we got an instrument, so then we also created how can one come on the exchange. So we created two pathways. One is you can just register without really raising the funds. Two is you register and then you raise, and then when you raise, you use this instrument and you list the instrument. So why I'm narrating all this is it's important to, if you want to scale up or if you want to create a nice structure, I think you have to think through all the parts. You have to think of the ecosystem. Then if the instrument is listed, the whole idea is getting more transparency, right? If you want an NPO to raise money, it has to be transparent. So what should be the disclosure template? So we came up with the disclosure template. Now once you have the disclosure template, then the question was, can you take it on the face value? I said, no, not in our system. Right? So, okay, then you need social audit. There are no social auditors. I mean, very few. So, what is the framework around social auditors? So create another new kind of, intermediary called social auditors. Who can be a social auditor, right? Who will regulate social auditors? Once you have them. So all these questions we answered. We worked on each of these dimensions. So today, I'm very proud to say that we have the full ecosystem in place. It's not that, and that's the reason, perhaps, that's the feedback we get. The rest of the world, wherever they tried this, it did not succeed much because all these important parts were not in place. So we thought, so there are two options. One is you just start with something and leave it to evolve. Two is, no, let's have the ecosystem in place and let's see how it goes, and we can keep refining the ecosystem. So we came with a full package. And now, coming to the question you said where we are, so we are, and also before I come to that, another important dimension was this market is mainly for sophisticated companies of certain size, certain expertise. I'm talking about the stock markets in the normal sense. With NPOs, we comfortable coming there and making those disclosures. They have the expertise. So we saw the need for a capacity building fund. So we've also got a capacity building fund now in place, which is actually administered by both NABARD and SIDBI. And also we have ICAI, we recognize them as the SRO for social auditors. So so today the concept is live and running. 10 NPOs, non-profit organizations, have registered, I think, in BSc, and 8 have registered in NSC. Both the exchanges have been permitted to start this SSC platform. And we're just hoping that we see someone come and raise money. That would be the real test, and how it goes. So I'll maybe just pause. Sorry.
No, this is great. This is great. We obviously many people in this room have been to a large extent. Just the needs, as Ramraj said, in terms of if you break it down, the whole climate imperative, and in the context of India, a lot of the development imperatives around financial inclusion, healthcare, education, even poverty alleviation, livelihoods, agriculture. As I tell my students a lot that India is a test bed for so many interesting structures and issues, and in fact, any kind of problem that exists in the world exists in India at scale, and more importantly, any opportunity that exists in the world exists in India at scale. So while we may talk about risks and issues, I think we should also really talk about opportunities, because I think they're quite immense. I would, before we get into everything, SEBI clearly has been a thought leader. I've had the opportunity to work with Mr. Singh on the working group around the social stock exchange, so we will touch a little bit based on that. But I think the vision that the regulator has shown here in terms of the importance of actually channeling capital to solve these issues, again, both from an opportunity and a risk mitigation standpoint, has been very commendable. So Mr. Singh, maybe you can just, given that you have a vantage point from your seat, if we talk about sustainable finance, which broadly saying this is finance going into climate issues and finance going into development issues, how would you assess where we are kind of in the big scheme of things as far as India goes?
You get the same return or better return. And I think there are studies by Harvard also, and Columbia University also. But there are some, the counter voices, and they believe, no, this is all nonsense. Sorry to use a strong word. I'm interested only in financial returns, and you heard that talk picking up more in the context of Ukraine war, and where the energy security became a big issue. And my understanding is a lot of ESG investors were also changing their strategies. They were open to investing in fossil fuel companies, or earlier they were not investing in defense, they were open to investing in defense after that. So those sort of counter voices are there. But what I get the sense, if you all things considered, I think this is a movement which has crossed the stage of U-turn. There could be temporary, some misdirection here and there, but in the long run, I think non-financial returns, and there is a regulatory challenge, and we will talk about that. It's just not the financial return, the non-financial aspects, and there are studies to show that non-financial aspects are they play a greater role in the decision making of an investor than just the financial.
Well, I think the reason they do that is that there's this dichotomy of short term versus long term, which people talk about a lot, but it actually comes into play really over here, which is that the so-called non-financial, let's say the ESG issues, are basically not really non-financial. I mean, if you don't have good governance, if you're not treating your employees well, if you're not operating as a responsible citizen in the communities that you operate, and you're going to pollute the world, over the long term, your companies will not have a license to operate and you will just get destroyed. And so I think investors actually are reaching that conclusion. It's really a question of aligning the long term and short term, so it's not either or. In terms of the studies that you mentioned, I think we've seen a lot of studies and we've done a lot, which basically show that companies which invest in the 4 or 5 ESG kind of oriented aspects, which are important or core to their business, and if they do that well, over the long time, that is actually very value creating. It's not just doing ESG for ticking the box and saying, okay, now I've done ESG so that now I can fall into some ESG index. What we're also seeing is that it's not, the investors are not, there's some who are just investing in indices, but that's less important in my mind than all this controversy around whether this ESG index is green or not, and the rating system, etc. But it's more about, look, if I think this is a good company long term, like for example, we've done a case study on Exxon at HBS, which I teach. It's a great company long term because it's got fantastic technology, and it actually is a bigger, in my view, and our view anyway, it's actually, Exxon being one of the largest oil companies in the world, is actually a huge part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem. And the solution is that is channeling money into carbon sequestering and carbon capture technologies over a period of time. Because any study which you see, and this is climate science, and even if you reduce emissions dramatically, unless we have technologies at scale which can suck carbon out of the air, we're not going to solve this problem. So coming back to the Indian context, though, for the purpose of this discussion, are there incentive systems that can be put in place by the government or by the regulators? Obviously, that's not the role, but just stepping outside your regulatory role, where more capital gets channeled into energy transition, we obviously have the green bond kind of structures, but are there more blended finance structures where the government can provide more incentives to bring in, private capital at scale? For example, like in the US, they have this, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, which has actually nothing to do with inflation reduction. I mean, it's actually highly inflationary, but they actually passed it, they called it that so that the Republicans would sign off on it. But essentially, it's nearly an $800 billion stimulus. It's 400 face value, but the tax incentives are pretty large, of channeling capital into energy transition. And that has now brought in, I read in 2022 itself, $70 billion of commitment on the private side into energy transition. So do you think there are things like, and a lot of that is blended finance because government is guaranteeing things or reducing risk, or not just the government, but even some of the foundations, etc. So any thoughts as to what we could do in the Indian context and blended finance?
Yeah, sure. So, so just to kind of quick reaction on the Inflation Reduction Act, I thought it was more to do with climate than with inflation. Yeah. And I think that is also, those kind of movements around the world, they are also, if I can say, changing the form of globalization, if I can say that, because now you'll have more and more firms setting up their offices, setting up their facilities in US rather than earlier they could have gone anywhere, right? So,
in fact, Europe has come up with its own version because all the European companies now go to the US, which is a good thing actually. That means more government sponsored or whatever sponsored is encouraging that. So maybe should India do something like that as well? Yeah, like the PLI scheme equivalent?
So I think you have something like PLI in production linked incentives that could be a proxy to maybe not so much focused on But I think the way forward would be this. So we need coal and we can't do without that. But can we get rid of it tomorrow? Obviously not. We have a lot of considerations around that. But I think over time, what would happen is that I think two things will be at play. One is incentivization, and second would be disincentivization. Right. So the market, it would seem to be a market play where you will be politically correct in all of this, and you will work towards more decarbonization through those kinds of incentive structures. Definitely, I think you need, if you need to move the needle faster, you would need that thinking. And I think India is doing well, that's my understanding. And I mean, the kind of commitments we made for ourselves by 2030, they're quite remarkable. And it's not just the talk, we're also walking the talk. That's what I would like to believe, going by whatever indicators we have so far. So that is one part. Now in terms of blended finance, even Mark Carney talked about it in that Z Funds initiative. So blended finance is being positioned as a solution, a potential solution for climate finance. So as Ramraj mentioned, there have been in various sectors, in healthcare, education and so on, there have been a lot of government schemes which are in some way blended finance models. But my thinking is we need to make it more mainstream, and we need to make it as a third alternative. Not just the conventional government spending and the private sector spending, but also third alternative because you need loads of capital and let it come from all sides. Right? And it could be philanthropic, it could be private, it could be public, it could be private equity, so various sources we need to leverage. And each of these components can leverage each other. And that's what your roughly the blended finance models would be. So yes, I mean.
So moving away from climate for a second, so we talked about some of the societal issues, and that was a little bit of the driving behind the social stock exchange, which you've been kind of leading in terms of bringing more capital into and using blended finance structures. Perhaps you could give us an update as to where things stand on the social stock exchange and where you see the path forward of that.
Yeah, sure. So before I maybe come to the update, I don't know if maybe let me just narrate as to how we went about it. Because if you need to scale blended finance structures, so I think the experience that we've had in setting up social stock exchange could be a sort of a, not exactly a role model, but could be one of the case studies. Because role model I can't say, I don't know where it will land eventually. So when this whole idea came to us that we were told by the government of India that we should do this, we should set up a social stock exchange for the benefit of both non-profits and for-profits. Frankly, we didn't have the capacity. So we thought we've always been used to dealing with the for-profit companies regulating greed in the market. It's a totally different ball game. So we reached out to people like you, and I reached out to you also. We created a working group, as you would recall. And but the way we approached, so that's interesting. So we thought, we have fantastic securities markets infrastructure. We have all the good practices that are there anywhere in the world in our securities. By the way, we became one of the first few countries to have T+1 settlement, and actually we are getting a lot of calls from all over the world as to how you did it, and anyway, that's a different point. So short point is we have a fantastic securities market infrastructure. We have great capacity in terms of manpower, resources, which has evolved over the last 3-4 decades in terms of setting up a modern trading infrastructure and primary market infrastructure. So challenge we gave ourselves was, can we leverage our strengths for the benefit of social sector? So can this structure be used for non-profits for raising money? Can there be an instrument around this? Because if you want to list at an exchange, you need an instrument to list. You need a via media to list. So we all debated, and then we came up with this whole idea of zero coupon, zero principal instrument, where it sounded like more like a donation certificate, but the difference was we added another element to it. We said zero coupon, zero principal, that we
so much of effort for like to reach here, so I hope my question is good. Now the thing basically is that when I make an investment in a stock market, a regular investment, in a regular stock market, I know I can compare, the performance of organizations because there's so much of data available. On the social stock exchange, one of the challenges which I think you should be thinking about is I'm not going to go through the portfolios. Currently you have 18. I'm hoping they'll become 1,800 in a few years' time. Now I can't possibly be going through the portfolio of every company, measuring them against their commitment and their performance thereof. There has to be some level of indexation where you are able to kind of find the right kind of companies, obviously based on the cause you might want to espouse or something like that, and then make that call. So I think that's something which the regulator needs to start thinking about now. Maybe now is not the time to have that index, but eventually you'll have to have some measure in place.
Yeah, so it's like people would like to ask a few questions to Mr. Singh before he goes back to make sure he regulates the greed in this world.
Really good for us to start off with understanding what is the future of social finance, how can it really catalyze impact on ground. And for this discussion, we have with us two very distinguished voices from the industry. Mr. Amarjit Singh, Executive Director, the Securities and Exchange Board of India. Mr. Singh, with his vast experience, has been involved in various regulatory initiatives and has also spearheaded the launch of the Social Stock Exchange. Sir, with SEBI's increasing focus on sustainable finance, we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how we could scale this up. And we have with us Mr. Vikram Gandhi, co-founder Asha Ventures and senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School. Sir, really glad to have your presence today. Mr. Vikram Gandhi has been a thought leader in the space of social finance and carries with him a vast experience over Indian and international markets. So with that, I would request the both of you to just kickstart the discussion.
Invested through the social stock exchange is quite limited. For example, CSR funding, which is growing in the country, is currently not allowed through the social stock exchange. So is the foreign funding, which falls under the purview of FCRA. So to make it a success, what is the government's thinking around allowing these two lines of capital to flow through the social stock exchange? This was that their relationship managers were at the front line of getting the healthcare deals, also kind of sometimes lack the understanding of health sector. So this kind of a facility has enabled building that capacity. Now deals come from the ground up, and based on our screening criteria, bank's due diligence, our due diligence gets structured. We then agree with those entities clear milestones for them to achieve over the next 6 to 8 months. And as they achieve those milestones, we keep reimbursing them a part of their interest burden. So that's how the social success note in this particular case works. Overall, in the last 2.5 years of investing, as I mentioned, we have kind of supported 60 plus enterprises. We have deployed so far close to $16 million of philanthropic money, and at a portfolio level got a leverage of $160 million. So kind of a 10x kind of a commitment from commercial investors coming in based on the support that philanthropic donors provided. And the story doesn't end there, because ultimately we are looking at impact, and for us the focus was that anything we do or any enterprise we support has to be penetrating to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 and rural areas, and has to be bringing down the cost of quality and affordable healthcare being available there for the vulnerable populations. One of the key indicators that we also used when it came to any enterprise was that are they going to make cost of delivery cheaper for any PMJY or any government insurance service provider, and if it was a government or if it was a service provider themselves, a tertiary or secondary hospital, then will our support increase the number of beneficiaries from that group that they kind of cater to? Give you a few examples. Hospitals that we started working with in remote locations were, for example, catering to only 5 to 10% PMJY beneficiaries when we entered. With our support and kind of the scale up that they were able to do, that 5 to 10% over a year's time became anywhere from 15 to 20%. So that's kind of jump. In many cases, it also rose as high as 30 to 40%. Like GRC hospitals that we work with in Assam.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and privilege for me to be here. I'm Ramraj, I head up the India Impact Investors Council. As all of you know, we are a not-for-profit industry body which has been set up almost 9 years now to focus on social impact investing in the country. As I'm sure we all face in our daily lives, the need for development capital in a country like India is very, very large. Particularly in a post-COVID scenario, this demand has only grown. And I think while there is substantial amounts of effort which is being done by our government, by our various development finance institutions, the reality of the situation is that even more capital is needed. And blended finance clearly is a space which offers potential solutions. It may not be in every facet of development finance, but there are many, many facets of the development sector where blended finance can be used and can be used much more effectively. And that's really the reason why we are here together to figure out how is it that we can build this market much better. India has had, by the way, a long history of blended finance. For a lot of people, there is a sense that this is some new technology that is being brought and this is something which has never happened. I think India has had a long history of the government actively engaging in various forms, whether it is through public sector banks, whether it is through viability gap funding which has come into many infrastructure projects. In many, many ways, concessional capital has been made available by the government or by quasi-government organizations in various fashions to attract commercial capital into various sectors. That said, there is a need for us to go beyond looking only to the government for this kind of effort, and there is an active need for us to think about how is it that we can sort of crowd in private commercial capital, how is it that we can crowd in philanthropies and foundations, how is it that we can crowd in CSR in a fashion that we can throw even more money at the development problems that we are facing as a country. What is also needed is to move the market in blended finance, the non-government market, if I have to say, which is presently small, fledgling. It's got a large number of transactions, but they are very sort of small in size, they are very frequent, and they are also, based on past experiences, having a certain complexity as far as structuring goes. So how is it that we can create larger scale blending vehicles which will allow for us to move larger amounts of money at scale into sectors which really need this and need this quickly. This problem is getting exacerbated also by the requirements that are already emerging on climate finance. And it's very clear that this is again a space where there will be an active need for blended finance and for infinitely risk-seeking grant capital which has to come in to support a lot of the new things that potentially we will be doing on the climate finance. And that's really why, as an IIC and Asha Impact, we thought it is important for us to sort of come together, bring the community together, see how we can work with government, with regulators, with philanthropies, with foundations, with impact investing, asset managers and others, to think about and conceptualize funding platforms which can, over a period of time, really attract large volumes of capital in a very simple, easy to understand and elegant manner, in a fashion that can create development at scale. So this event is really a part of our efforts in that direction. As I think Divya spoke, we are releasing the first report on the state of blended finance in India. We've covered a lot of data over the last 10 years. So this is the first report which is really looking at data over the last 10 years. We're also launching blendedfinance.org, which is going to be a one-stop shop for anything and everything related to blended finance. It can be used by students who want to come in and learn. It can be used by practitioners who want to see what are the latest deals. It can be used by other people who want to see what are the latest developments coming up in this area of blended finance. And it is indeed a huge pleasure for us at IISc to work with Asha to bring this together to you. A lot of the work that IISc is doing is a part of the larger India Blended Finance Collaborative, which is a new initiative that the IISc started about 7-8 months back. It's a loose partnership for a variety of people interested in blended finance, and the whole sort of agenda and the effort is to see how can we evangelize this, how can we bring more people under this tent. The IBFC is supported by USAID, and they've been a huge help to us in bringing this together and creating a whole host of capacity building and other workshops in this area. I do hope this is going to be a valuable and important session. And before I sort of hand over the mic back to Divya for the rest of the session, welcome sir, Mr. Amarjeet Singh ji. It's really, thank you very much for being here and participating and supporting us with your presence. And I'm sure over the next few weeks and months, we will work with you and under your guidance, whether it is under the social stock exchange or otherwise. We do hope that we can take this message in a much bigger way to the larger development market in the country. Thank you all, and hope this is going to be a wonderful session. Back to you, Divya.
This sector needs a better knowledge base, and that can be done only by certain entities which come in and provide it, because the investors, donors, etc. are all across the globe. It's not like everybody sitting here in India and are very easily accessible. So I think a platform is important in this sector and sharing of knowledge, so that is one thing. But the government did announce it in the last budget that blended finance is going to be structures which we are going to be working on with maximum government participation of up to 20%. And I think RBI and SEBI are working on this with ISSG, and in the next few months we should be seeing some movement in the sector, so that should be a welcome move if it works out. But I think it's mostly information and knowledge about this which is required for this to really take off in the sectors where it's required. Even international funds usually come for very typical of few sectors, and the requirements for each of our countries is large and varied, and I think somewhere that needs to be solved for.
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree. See, I mean, the way I was sort of looking at this, if you see your CSR market, it's about 70-80,000 crore market. Okay, if you look at the philanthropy market, I don't know, maybe even if I say it's 25-30,000 crores, let's say in that zone. And I know this sounds very spacious, but even if I look at 5% of that 80,000, it's about 3-4,000 crores. Maybe another 1,000 crores from a philanthropy, and then you have the DFIs, NABARD, SIDBI. Let's say you're able to put together 7-8,000 crore of grant corpus, and that is leveraged even conservatively 3-4 times. You're talking of a balance sheet size of about 35-40,000 crores. And this could be across various forms of blend. There could be equity type blended finance, there could be debt type blended finance. So something like more like a fund of funds with daughter funds. If it is placed in a larger institutional structure, first of all, the scale in itself is going to attract a lot of players, because yes, not-for-profits will have these kind of challenges. But I think the aspiration for scale is there with everybody, and if you're going to get 5 crores out of this, possibly it's something that, but let us say today, Pratham and Akshay Patra, maybe we talk of the top 5-10 people, come in and say, hey, this is going to be a large sum of money which is available. There is a certain sort of, if I may say, disruptive scale which exists. Because I remember reading in the papers just last few days back, that government is thinking about 5 dedicated work. But perhaps there is a need for us to sort of put some dedicated base, like the solar sector has the SFC, the Solar Finance Corporation, the agri sector has, NABARD. I think at some level, we will have to, for the social impact sector, bring a certain bunch of players together who with leverage will be, even in 5 years time, if we could think even of a 10,000 CR effective market size, then you will create something which is sort of very dramatically disruptive. Otherwise, I mean, my sense was that the market will continue to develop. Yes, we will continue to grow. But how is it we can channelize? And once we do all of that, Soumya, then for family offices to see this large institutional character, them putting in additionally, maybe 1 crore, 2 crores, 5 crores, the top 100 family offices, even if few of them put it together under the, and I know it sounds very fancy and very out of the box, but we may have to at some level, engage at and showcase this at some larger level with NABARD, with SIDBI, and I know I have spoken to a lot of these organizations. There is a lot of readiness to at least start thinking about some of these structures. We are just going to stop now and maybe open up for any questions. Any thoughts from some of the people in the audience? We have about 5-7 minutes before we sort of close and go for closing remarks. So any questions, any sort of areas, please.
Just one comment to what you said, Raman. Maybe there's a need for through the India Blended Finance Collaborative, if it is an initiative, if it is an association, really to put up to government or regulators what is it we want. Because what you also want is for the investor regulatory consistency. When you're making an investment, because if it's going to keep changing within a few years or otherwise, then all your math is going to be out of the way. Is going to go out of the window. So some of that I think also needs to come in as the entire industry evolves.
Absolutely. That is one of the biggest challenges, Soumya, you are well aware. Whether it is IT, income tax issues, FCRA issues, which is why an institutional character is needed to kickstart this market. Otherwise, bespoke transactions, admirable as they are,
you have a mutual fund association, you have a registered investment advisors association. Similarly, why don't we use this as the platform to create?
Fantastic. No, I think that's a great point. Any questions? Yeah, please.